nuance and complexity of those experiences, and try to understand how public policies have harmed many of the communities that I hold near and dear to my heart. Um, and think about my work and how I might be helpful in helping to transform communities. Um, when I think about, I'm sorry, I have to say, so I just want to tell you in advance, I'm not good at advancing my own slides. So um, just bear with me here. So I want to say that we are living in these extraordinary times, and the decisions that we make now about how to engage others and how we show up with the moral courage to support and protect and provide for those with less power, influence, and ability will determine our future and whether we will become fully further disconnected or fully realize our shared humanity. And I believe in this moment, unlike many others, there's an opportunity to build and create new systems, from the economy to the healthcare to childcare systems. We have an opportunity to build a more just and equitable society. There's just so much going on. And I think, probably yourself too, people say, oh, 2020 is just so horrible. We just need to do over, when is 2021 coming? But I actually, for myself and for my work, I really believe that it's really an opportunity to think about and imagine what a more just and equitable society should look like, and whose experience should be at the center of those conversations, and how do we create policies and systems and institutions that work for the most of us, as opposed to the few. Um, so in my time with you, I want to first start out by talking about some of the constraints to creating public and social policies that center the most impacted and most disadvantaged. Then I will talk about, or I'll focus on what's possible with an intersectional framework and approach to policymaking. Like, why should we be doing it? Why, what do we get out of a more inclusive policymaking and implementation model? So, in my own work, see, okay, so in my own work, I've been thinking about a gender equitable recovery, right? So that recovery, in the States is all the rage. It's what we're talking about. Like, how do we get back and build a better economy for women, working women, families, people of color? There's racial unrest. And so we also are thinking about racism, racial discrimination, these other unjust systems like mass incarceration. By the way, I also teach in this moment, which I think is really exciting, a course on gender, race, and incarceration, which again, in this moment seems to be really powerful because in real time, we get to think about policies and strategies that we need, for people who are formerly incarcerated, as well as, communities, and thinking about like, how do we disrupt the school to prison pipeline, mass incarceration, all of these things. So in my work today, I'm not only thinking about short-term strategies, I'm also thinking about overhauling systems and institutions for the long haul. So again, I think this moment presents us with the opportunity to be bold, to think big, to think out of the box. And I think we need that in order to really get to wherever we are thinking we want to go, especially as you all are graduate students, which, I can relate. It was many years ago, but, I know what it's like to be there and just your mind swimming with tons of ideas and strategies and solutions, and thinking about like, well, how am I going to, do this in the world? Like, how am I going to make it happen? So, back to my work. So I just want to say, I hopefully, I get to talk to you a little bit after this is over about your own work and some of the things that you're thinking about. So recently I've been thinking about, again, like I said, a gender equitable recovery, and things that I think in order for women to re-enter the workforce and sustain employment will have to be in place. But as you know, especially in the US context, we've had a horrible childcare infrastructure or care infrastructure that has only gotten worse since the start of the pandemic. And many working women, many single mothers, many women knew that the system, the childcare system wasn't working anyway. It was never working. Even I remember after giving birth to my children, I have 10-year-old twins, but shortly after giving birth, I had to return to work. And I remember searching for childcare in New York City. And I remember thinking, I don't understand how anybody affords childcare. And I'm going to have to go to Craigslist to find some care. And I don't understand why women don't start a revolution. But what happened was my paternal grandmother came to New York, and she stayed with my children while I went back to work for 18 months. And I did what most women do, most working women, most women do. They figure it out on themselves, by themselves. Childcare is not framed in the U.S. context as an institutional or systemic problem. It's framed as a individual problem that women and families have to solve. So here's my chance. I'm leading this think tank. My own history and experiences tells me that childcare is critically important to working women. In this recovery, we know that women have been doing double duty, both taking care of their children because schools are closed and daycares are closed, but also still expected to work 40 to 50 hours a week. So for me, I believe that this is our Overton window moment where we can say and really try to think creatively about creating a childcare system infrastructure that works because this is a time where we're having those conversations. So we're thinking about this report, we're pulling it together, and part of my task and thinking about participatory policymaking is to talk to providers, talk to experts, talk to women and families to see what they say and what they need. So I was in conversation with a noted childcare advocate, and I was sharing with her some of the ideas that I had about rebuilding or creating a childcare infrastructure that works. And I said, well, I think it should be childcare should be a public good, that everybody should be able to access it, regardless of the child's age, and there should be no income limits, right? So anybody could tap into this system. And she said to me, she said, well, I think you have to think about what camp you want to be in. Do you want to be in the Bernie Sanders camp, or do you want to be in the Elizabeth Warren, Biden camp that's a little more moderate? And so she was telling me, she already was giving me a frame for which I could sort of think about the childcare infrastructure. And then I said, well, I don't think about it that way. I said, where I want to start is I want to think about women and families and actually what they need and create a policy infrastructure that meets the needs of those women and families. Then after that, if it happens to be super progressive and over on this side of the continuum, that's fine. But if it turns out that it's more moderate or conservative, that's fine too. But I don't want to set my parameters and my framework before I've had a chance to think about in this moment and how we build not edges and makes incremental change. But if we were going bold, what might a childcare infrastructure look like, right? So she says, okay, I got you there. That makes sense. But then she started to talk about the other things. Like, what if? She said, well, I don't think millionaires should have access to free childcare, right? Like, you don't want Ivanka Trump tapping into this system, right? And I said, oh, I actually don't care. I said, I actually don't care. Just like Everybody has access to the Grand Canyon, millionaires and working class people. Um, that's, I mean, it's a public, it would be a public good. So, and people who don't want to access it don't have to access it. And so we were getting into these ideological conversations about, well, what does it mean? And then she was like, well, be careful. You don't want to do this. Be careful. Don't forget about these guys. They don't like that thing. And then, and this gets me into my conversation, this sets up my conversation about constraints. I was like, I mean, how can you be bold and really be thinking outside of the box and challenging systems and rebuilding if you have all of these constraints before you even put together a policy that might transform the system, right? So every issue I raised, she had a reason, a person, a group, a concern, a consideration for why it wouldn't work. So, fortunately, I'm actually one of those people who, it doesn't matter. I'm going to still think, imagine, dream, so that we can really get to a place where we're imagining something new, something bolder, something fresher. Which gets me to my first constraints, is that I realized that the progressives and those who want big change, like we say we want big change, we have the big critique of mass incarceration is wrong, why the system is not working, the economy is not working for women and families. We have the critique, we say we want big change, but when it comes time to dream big about, what might we replace a system with, then we become really very limited and very small. And we don't realize that the systems and institutions we're talking about are really very entrenched, and we're trapped in the policy models and frameworks that no longer work or maybe have never worked. Yet we are still operating as if they do, or as if they just need a quick fix, a small change. And we critique and we understand inequality, but the solutions and the alternatives either build on existing flawed policies or systems, make incremental change, or belong to a particular way of thinking. And so what I'm proposing, or what I'm thinking about in this moment, is another way, a third way, a fourth way, that may or may not include the former policy models or our ways of thinking about a particular issue. And I'm also advocating for a type of honesty around policymaking, and this kind of policies we have around big social problems, is that they haven't been working. So we can just be honest, when we even look at the issue of poverty, hunger, any of our bigger issues, pay equity, by the way, pay equity has only moved about 20 cents over the last 30 years. So literally whatever we've been doing hasn't been effective in accelerating change. And so if we know that to be the case, then from my perspective, it's really about thinking about, okay, well, is there another way that we have not considered that we need to propose? And in this moment, some of those things or some of those ideas may seem crazy making, right? But I want to say that they're actually not crazy making. And I'm going to give COVID as an example. So before January or before COVID, the conversations around basic income, economic impact payments, expanded unemployment insurance for workers, paid sick leave, they were not even on the table. Those ideas were considered long shots, not going to happen. We don't have the money. We don't have the resources. We can't do that. A pandemic hits, which arguably is a catastrophic or a really big, huge crisis. And all of a sudden, those ideas are on the table. In fact, we implement those things. we have economic impact payments, goes to everybody. Somehow we figure out how to get a check in everybody's mailbox and bank account. For gig workers, people who we said didn't qualify for unemployment insurance or benefits, somehow they all got benefits, they all got support. And then we came out with a plan for people who, if they were home taking care of a sick parent, they would also be compensated or receive some, financial and economic support. So the policies that we said were impossible just 6 months ago, at least on a short-term basis, we did those things. And so again, we have been constrained by these very narrow, small policy boxes in our way of thinking about what change has to look like and the pace that it should go. The second constraint that I want to talk about is about the connectedness of social problems. And the unwillingness to see the connectedness means that the policy solutions and strategies created are only partial. They're not whole, and as a result are ineffective. So for example, it's difficult to address the issue of mass incarceration or the prison industrial complex unless you address educational inequity, community infrastructure, racial profiling, over-policing, disinvestment in communities, and the hand of corporations and for-profit businesses that sees incarcerated bodies as profit and as a part of their bottom line. And so we have not, in a lot of instances with our policymaking, it's very siloed, figured out how to connect the dots around these, what's happening and the experiences in people's lives. Because if we did, we would have public policies that are connected and consideration of how one system might be impacting another system for people and communities. The last constraint that I want to talk about is fear. The fear of putting forth, again, bold, out of the box ideas, believing that they will be torn apart, shelved, or dismissed as undoable. It's that fear that leads us back to these failed policy models and solutions that have not worked. And the fear doesn't inspire boldness and creativity. It keeps us small. It's conformity, it's acceptable, and it's safe. And I've been working and doing advocacy work for about 20 years now, maybe a little longer now, but and what is true is that when I started doing this work, it's longer, so I was going to say, so when I started doing this work in college, I met a group of activists and advocates, and and many of them are my colleagues today in the work. But I have to say, much of our thinking about policy solutions and strategies are all kind of meshed together, and we all say, okay, well, this is our position on this thing. And so there is power in sort of pushing a particular policy position as a group, because we know that. But if the policy that we're pushing and we're advocating is not bold or big or inclusive, then if it's not bold and big, then what we're pushing for is not going to solve the problem that we say that we are attempting to solve through our collective efforts. So what else did I say? Okay. The other thing, this is the last thing I'll say about the constraints, is that the fear of not going big is also hurting us in our work. Because I think that when we're not thinking about the most impacted and centering the people who are most marginalized or impacted by policy or compromise and negotiate when people's lives, we can't negotiate people's lives, right? So racism, sexism, poverty, homophobia should not be up for compromise or negotiation. But when we think about the policy models that we currently have, that's what happens. Good policy making is negotiation, it is compromise. But what happens is that the people who are most often to lose out in those compromises are people of color, women of color, people with the least amount of power and resources in society. So now that I've spent a little bit of time talking about constraints, I want to talk about what's possible and how we might move forward towards a more inclusive policymaking model and strategy. And I want to start by talking about intersectionality. So when I start my talks about intersectionality, I like to use this quote by Mari Matsuda. And she says that when I see racism, I look a bit deeper and I ask myself, where is the sexism? Where is the homophobia? Where is the classism or ethnocentrism? Because I know that it's there. And the reason why I love this quote, because I do think it's an intersectional approach, and it encourages us, especially those of us in positions of power, to ask deeper questions if we're framing, as a feminist, if, we're looking at something and calling it sexist, how do we look at that same thing and name the racism and the homophobia and the transphobia in that same thing? Right? When we do that, we create a more nuanced understanding of the issue. And then when we do that, our policies and our recommendations include that knowing, I love this, by the way. This is the best. I was tired before this. I love this. This is amazing. I love talking about this stuff. This is great. So here we go here. So let's talk about what is intersectionality and what's an intersectional approach to policymaking. So intersectional approach to policymaking examines issues of social change and equality multi-causally and intersectionally. And I'm going to show you the model in just a second, to generate policy solutions and strategies that are inclusive and gets to the root causes of a social problem or issue. And I'm going to just give you a quick example. So if you, for example, I'm going to go here. I'm going to show you this for a second. So this is the model, the intersectional approach model. So if traditionally, I'm going to take the issue of violence against women. If you're thinking about violence against women, so in the 60s, 70s, let's say 70s, violence against women, the explanation for violence against women was sexism. Right? So the reason why women, and sexism and misogyny. So the reason why women experience violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, was the result of sexism, masculine social systems, sexist, masculinist culture. And so if you have that frame around violence against women and what causes it, then your solutions and strategies will be rooted in trying to end sexism, patriarchy, and misogyny, right? And so I want to fast forward to the 1994 Violence Against Women Act that took a frame that centered gender and I would say the experiences of middle-class women for us to understand this what was supposed to be a very sweeping federal legislation to address violence against women. And when gender was centered, it missed out on the experiences of women of color. It missed out on the experiences of LGBT, transgender folks, lower income women, immigrant women. And so those experiences, especially with the first passage in 1994, were missing from the initial legislation. And also there was an over-reliance on law enforcement in the first piece of legislation, which, as we know, women of color and lower income communities have a very precarious relationship with law enforcement. And so again, an intersectional approach model, as you can see here, centers age, race, ethnicity, nationality, sexual orientation, gender identity, ability, class, all these markers of difference at the same time. And so it disallows us to have a very monocausal explanation of a particular issue, right? So you start here with everything, all these markers of difference at the center. And then also what you see, all around the political, institutional, representational, and economic dimensions is the fact that all of these things at one time are impacting people's experiences. So the political institutions, the representation of groups and societies, the economic, all of those things are impacting people's experiences in society. Let me go back here. So let's talk about what is intersectionality. Intersectionality refers to the way race, class, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, ability, status, and other markers of difference intersect to inform individual realities and lived experiences. It recognizes that individuals and groups are shaped by multiple and intersecting identities. These identities often inform an individual's worldview, perspective, and relationship to others in society. So it impacts a group's, sense of fairness, power, resources, where you stand, your social location is critically important. And when we think about policy making, we understand that where you stand, your social location, what you see as the problem is informed by your social, your social location. There are two main assumptions when we think about the intersectional approach model. The first is that we all have points of privilege and points of oppression, right? And that's just the idea that we're all, even white men, we all have multiple dimensions to us. So for me, as a Black, queer, single mother by choice, I embrace all of my identities. It's being all those things in a racist, classist, homophobic society that is the problem. So, and thinking about that's where I find power, but if those things are not valued in any particular society, then that just, that impacts my experiences. It also recognizes that my education and my class privilege at this point, and also my citizenship status, places me in a position of privilege because of all those things are valuable in a US context, right? So, for using in an intersectional approach model, identities are not hierarchical, they are intersecting, right? The second point, the starting assumption is that all systems and structures of discrimination and inequities are linked, and which, I mentioned that a little bit earlier. And it's just the idea that the systems and structures that maintain racial and ethnic privilege are the same systems and structures used to maintain gender, class, and heterosexual privilege. So when we talk about, well, we don't have time to sort of address the nuances of violence against women, or we'll get to that, we'll get to domestic workers when we're talking about pay equity. It's the recognition that the same system that's maintaining racial or class privilege is also maintaining these other privileges. So using an intersectional approach to policymaking, we understand that we have to be very intentional about centering those experiences and understanding how they are impacting a particular social problem. So the last thing I want to say about this before we talk about how to think about the policy making models using an intersectional approach is that the intersectional approach allows us to understand that systems, policies, and institutions are perpetuated, maintained, and enforced by people. And I think this is really important because every time I'm talking about, especially in organizing circles or even in my students, I teach a participatory policymaking class. And on the day one, I say, well, we're always talking about the system, or we'll talk about the man, or we'll talk about they. They is really important in these conversations for social change. And I said, well, they is us, actually. We are the ones who are, whether, implicitly or in our intentionally or unintentionally maintaining these systems of privilege and discrimination, or these systems that we claim are not working for us, people are the ones that maintain them. Um, and so that means that they're not mysterious, or they're not happening to us. And what that also means is that we, people, have the power to change these systems, to disrupt them, to build better systems, right? So it, again, we can talk about, again, how do we, one, reveal these systems and institutions, and then how do we make policies that are aimed at overhauling them, dismantling them, making them better for the most impacted. Okay, where are we? How are we with time? I feel like I'm in class right now. I want to talk about, so these are the forms of intersectionality. I can also, so that we save time for questions and stuff, email the presentation so that you can have it. I don't know if that you find that helpful.
Yes, that would be incredibly helpful, but we're good on time, so we're loving the energy. Keep going.
Okay. So again, like you saw in the model, there are different forms of intersectionality. I tell you something, I can go through these and give you tons of examples, but I won't do that. I will, but just suffice it to say that there are 5 different forms of intersectionality: structural, political, institutional, representational, and economic. And all of these things are working together, especially when we think about policies. And policy making, and informing people's experiences with systems and institutions present in society. I just wanted to show you that they're there. Okay, so let's talk about, why is an intersectional policymaking approach important? Okay, so the first thing is that it shifts us from an episodic to chronic system framing of issues and problems. So when I say it shifts us, what I mean is that the problems becomes less about individual behavior, so success or failings, and focuses on more of a systemic issue or problem. So for example, when you talk about issues like poverty, the biggest argument against anti-poverty programs is that, like, if you work hard enough, you're going to make it. And if you don't work hard enough, if you don't work hard enough, then you will be impoverished. But that framework places the blame on individuals, individual failings, individual behavior, as opposed to systems and institutions that might be impeding people's opportunities, life chances, and outcomes. And it also doesn't pay attention to those other factors, like, the education system, the community infrastructure, and all those things, how all those things might be influencing individual behavior. And so shifting from an episodic to chronic system failing allows us to have a bigger and better analysis of a problem. And the same thing is true when we think about police brutality or mass incarceration. If you think it's about one bad cop that did one bad thing at one particular point in time, you're likely to address that particular cop or that wrongdoing, hopefully, because we know how that goes. Or if you say it's not episodic, it's not one bad cop, it's a result of a failed system, or a system that is embedded and entrenched with racist behaviors and a way of seeing people in communities of color that is problematic, and that leads to bad behavior, right? So it's just a big, it's a big shift. And I've already given you the child care example. And so when we begin to ask different questions about their systems and the relationships to challenges, we begin to talk about systems change. And so I just want to say that making policy around systems change is much harder than making policy around individual behavior, right? Because most of our policy models, especially around social problems, is around shifting individual behavior rather than changing systems, right? So even when we think about welfare reform, that was about, in 1996, that was about changing people's behavior, not changing a system where women are impoverished and families don't have what they need to survive economically. And it also allows for a more complex and nuanced analysis of individuals, families, and communities. And it asks us, we get to ask different questions like, how did we get here in the first place? Um, you know, how did it get this way? Were there some other bad policies that contributed to this problem, right? So when you talk about poverty and you talk about income disparities, wealth in particular for communities of color, I'm speaking in the US context, you can see that redlining, discriminatory lending practices, lack of access to jobs and education and training, impacts present, people of color, women's present day experiences, in poverty, the lack of wealth, the lack of, the gap in home ownership are a result of historic bad policies. But if you don't provide that context or analysis, you won't know that what people are experiencing now is a result of previous bad policies and bad behavior by who? People enforce those bad policies. And then it also, again, accounts for the ways in which race, class, gender, and other markers of difference influence outcomes and individual behavior and institutions and practices. And the other thing is that, policies that purport to be neutral, because one of the things, for us as policymakers or decision makers is like, this idea of being unbiased and the policies are neutral. But what we've seen and what we know is that there is not one ever neutral policy that is value free. Policy is where we write our values, where we state our values. And so even policies that purport to be neutral are not ever so. And they're driven by the people who have the most power and influence in society. So an example that I want to give you is, again, the 1996 Welfare Reform Act. So in the US, these are all US contexts and examples, sorry. I know domestic US policy best. The 1996 welfare reform policy was supposed to transform or change welfare as we know it. But the policy, whatever was being proposed at the time by Bill Clinton and, Congress, depended heavily on controlling images of Black and brown women as welfare queens. And they were also framed as unworthy of support, lazy, baby-making machines, and cheats. Even though when we look statistically, Black women proportionally were not the ones who were, using or accessing the social service, welfare. But that didn't stop those images from driving and creating the policy that we saw on the other end. So the policy that we saw on the other end, driven by, again, those with power, resources, and a social location that didn't allow them to understand the experiences of the most impacted. We got a harsh policy that imposed work requirements, limited support regardless of family size, and imposed unreasonable time limits. The policy that came out on the other end was not reflective of the lives of the women that they were saying that they were supposed to be helping. And so there's a lot of debate about whether or not that policy was successful. I'm going to say it's not, because poverty is still up and women are still suffering. And it also at the time didn't allow for education and training to be counted towards work and work requirements. So this idea that what was wrong was that people don't want to work, as opposed to, women are the primary caretakers in their families. And so if they have young children, women will be the ones who we expect to stay home with their children and to take care of them. And so how do we make sure that they are able to, not only provide for themselves, but their families? But that wasn't the goal. The goal was framed as getting people, lazy people, women of color, cheats, framed as off the welfare rolls. And if that was the goal, then that was achieved, by the way. So in this example, in the example I just gave, we see how the representation of groups in society, the beliefs and values of those least impacted, but with the most power, make decisions that impact the most vulnerable. So, okay, so I talked about it allows for a more complex and nuanced analysis of individuals and families. Again, how do we get there? And then the last thing I want to talk about before I talk about implementation and why it's so hard in some instances and what we must do is that using an intersectional approach model to policymaking allows us to be able to develop targeted programs and strategies to address inequalities. Again, we don't start at the individual level, we start at the system level and the institutional level, and think about why systems are not working and how systems and institutions become impediments to people's economic security, well-being, and these other indicators of well-being, as opposed to helping them or opening up the pathway. And then it also allows us to think about equitable solutions, not equal solutions. We're talking about equitable solutions because what I would argue is that due to historic cumulative disadvantage, again, the result of harmful policies, calls for us to make people whole. And so making people whole might entail additional investments in resources over and above what's being invested in other communities. And so again, that is not the way that we think about policymaking. In a policymaking model, there's a cost benefit analysis, there are winners and losers. And so shifting from a winner to loser perspective and think about, okay, how do we get to what's equitable? How do we lead with our values? How do we think about the most impacted and center those people's or those experiences in our policymaking approach? So let me see, what do I have? Let me see what do I have here. Implementation. So in terms of implementation, I don't want to spend too much time talking about implementation because that's a whole nother lecture, by the way. But for me, implementation is iterative. It involves back and forth, always analyzing and always allowing for adjustments and change. And it's not static, and it allows for correction. So a lot of times when we have policies that are harmful, it takes a long time before, even if we realize it right away that it's not working. Let's take the 3 strikes law or the disparities in sentencing between cocaine and crack. It took years and years before the disparity was corrected. But in that I don't want to say excuse me, I don't know the exact year, so I don't want to misquote. But in that time period, millions and millions of people and lives and families were torn apart by these harmful policies related to the sentencing disparities and swelling prisons across the country. And so, but being able to identify quickly when there's unequal implementation or there's unintended consequences is important in thinking about implementation or implementing a model. And we also know that backlash and renegotiation of a policy is also a very real concern in terms of implementation. And so what we know is that those who have power, who are not in favor of many policies that we find equitable or the systems change that we're advocating for, respond to it by attempting to renegotiate the terms of that policy. And an example I want to give is in our good state of Florida, where majority of the majority of the state voted to reinstate the voting rights of formerly incarcerated people. And shortly thereafter, a group of Congress people went forth and said, well, that's fine. You can have your right to vote back. But before you do that, you have to pay all your fines, your fees and fines. And if you can't do that, then you can't vote. But we all know that fees and fines, one is one of the number one barriers for reentry or going back to prison, and also for poor people, traps them and keeps them in the criminal legal system. So to impose that as a barrier to, exercising one's right to vote is just that type of renegotiation. And so thinking about, how do we in our implementing really account for that kind of renegotiation, the disparate impact of the implementation of this policy on groups and communities. So to close, I want to begin where I started. I do believe we're in an extraordinary moment. We have an opportunity to be really bold, to use a policy framework that is more reflective of this moment, which I would argue this intersectional approach that is more inclusive, representative, thinks about systems and institutions and how we got there, is the kind of model that as you go on to do your work, is where we want to be headed. And that, just being really honest about, like, if something is not working, a system is broken, just to say it's broken, and let's not tinker around the edges, and let's think about, like, what do we need in its place? I think is really where we need to be right now. And this is the moment for us to do that. So, and I want to leave you all, before we open it up, with this quote from civil rights leader and criminal justice advocate, Bryan Stevenson. And he says that the opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice. And for me, the quote is in this quote is the idea that we're beyond, or we should be getting beyond incremental fixes to broken system. But it's about building more just and equitable society where we all thrive. And justice is the goal. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so incredibly much. I probably speak for many when I say we wish we could take your course. It's been very insightful and incredible. So yes, I'm going to open it up. Please raise your hand through Zoom, I guess, if you have a question. But I also see that we actually have Dean Velasco. So I want to give you an opportunity to speak or say hi if you're available.
I am indeed. I just came to learn and to listen and to be educated. So thank you very much for organizing this. That was a very, very interesting presentation. I took notes. Thank you, Nicole, for joining us. Thank you to technology. I imagine you're in the US, so the fact that we can do this is absolutely wonderful. The pandemic has been painful, but it's not holding us back. And I'm very curious to see what kind of a dialogue and what kind of a discussion will follow. As I've told the organization many times, I'm very impressed by the work that women at the School of Public Policy have been doing for a long time and continue to do. And I'm very happy to be a part of this.
Thank you. Great to meet you.
My pleasure. Welcome. Thank you for doing this.
So I would actually, if it's okay, I'd love to start off with a few questions. So I imagine, and you can of course speak to this, that we're going to get pushback when it comes to trying to convince the people who often have the least to lose why it's more important to take an intersectional approach. So what are some strategies that you recommend to just keep pushing and not give up when they say, no, let's just focus on one thing, when we have to look at that bigger picture and the intersections of those who are impacted?
So I mean, as you all are starting your careers and thinking about the work that you will do and the writing you will do, and some of you will go on to get your PhD. And for me, I can just give you my own advice that I can just tell you what I did. That's it. Um, it is to stay true to what you know to be true. If your understanding of a social issue includes the experiences and the, of people who are most impacted, or includes a model that is not being widely used or circulated, use it anyway. Talk about it the way you want to talk about it. Raise the questions. I remember being in graduate school, and I was one of two people of color. I don't want to say women of color in the program, and the other one dropped out after the first semester. So you can probably know how problematic the program was. And so, and I remember raising the question. I said, well, what about race? Because we're as a political science course. And he said, I don't think it really matters. I don't think it has an impact on what's happening here. Now, I mean, you're the I'm in the academy, I'm learning the canon. They're telling me how to think about a thing, how to think about a problem. But instead of accepting that answer and sort of shrinking my analysis, I said, well, I'm going to find a place where this analysis, this framework, this thinking is encouraged. And so I had to go outside of my department and find mentors and find communities that supported that analysis and framework. And that was about 15 years ago, by the way. And so now I think there's more space for these ideas, more nuanced ideas. And so there is a broader, bigger community for these ideas. But I think we need to get into the public square and fight and engage these ideas. Like the intellectual sparring, the public debate, the friendly public discourse, we don't have that a lot anymore. It's very, you're over here, I'm over here. But I really enjoy and want to bring back the space where we can engage ideas, spar to, we have competing ideas. So I think there's pushback, and I'm at an organization, by the way, I started out talking about IWPR. When I came, I've been there a year, it'll be a year tomorrow, by the way. They had no intersectional analysis. They were doing doing work on women in the economy, and intersectionality was not the frame that they led with. And because of my experience, I said, well, good news. That's what we lead with now. And so you'll be in a position, at 20 years old, I was not in that position. 22 years old, I was not in that position to say, this is how we're going to think about these ideas. But I held on to what I knew to be true about a particular kind of analysis and thinking about the work. And, in my work today, as I'm leading this think tank, I can lead with that framework and also invite other people and show them how to do it and how to lead with it and what this analysis adds to thinking about policy. And by the way, the organization, since we've done that, has tripled its investments in revenue and resources and support, because that is right. That nuanced way of thinking about this is right. Even though, there's, again, challenges, renegotiations to this framework.
Thank you. That's so inspiring, especially to know how much the organization has been pushed forward since you've been able to join them. And they are very lucky. And it's very nice to know that we should always just stay true to what we know works. And one day we'll get the opportunity to see it to fruition. So I will now, let's see, I think we have a question from Lydia. Go ahead. Lydia.
Sorry, I was on mute. Okay, first of all, thank you so much for this talk. This was so wonderful to hear all of your input, especially we're doing intersectionality now. That's just great. So So my question is sort of like Awole, is sort of similar to what Awole brought up, which is you mentioned one of the constraints to these inclusive policies was the idea of like this sort of fear of sort of more newer, bolder, more creative solutions. And so what approaches have you found either in your research or in your experience that sort of help people get over that fear? Like what can we do as future policymakers to push forward things that might be a little bit more outside the bounds, but are very promising?
So I think it's really hard. So the fear is very real. And I think it's real for me too. Like we're writing this recovery report and I keep looking over my shoulder, like, is this right? Can I say this? This is, I don't know. Maybe it's not right. I don't know. I don't want to get attacked. And frankly, I've had that feeling ever since graduate school because that's, what happens. You're afraid of like, will your ideas be shot down? Will they be torn apart? Will my professor agree? And da, da, da. And by the way, it doesn't stop, when you're in your work life, especially if you're doing this work, there's always a contestation. It's always the fear of, did I get it right? Is my analysis correct? Did I leave something out? For me, and I was just on a phone with another advocate who was not like the first one I described. And she said, Nicole, I know that, childcare is a public good. Childcare starting at zero with no income limits seems crazy making. She said, it seems like, it may sound like you're on Jupiter. She said, but if you think that that's right, if that's the right thing for women and families, I say you put it out there. And what that does is expand the frame and the argument, the public space. So now people have to consider it as an idea of one of the ideas that are on that's on the table for consideration. If I don't put that idea out, whether people rip it apart or make it stronger, then we don't have that idea in the public square. So we're going to do it. If you read the recovery report that'll come out in a couple of weeks, we're going to lead with that because that's the right thing to do, because we think that that is what we should be thinking about. Now, as I said, there's going to be negotiation and, well, no, not everybody, the millionaires, they have to pay something. They have, okay, we'll get there. We're going to figure it out. But I don't want to constrain my idea or what I think is right by shrinking it into a box of what's possible or what has been done, because, it hasn't worked.
Thank you. And I see Lauren, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Hello. Thank you so much again for coming and speaking with us. This has been really great, particularly on the subject of intersectionality. About poverty, you got into that a little bit when discussing intersectionality. What is something that you feel people too often do not understand about the challenges of escaping poverty and what that really means?
I think that, at least for me, it's this idea that it's an individual failing, and not system driven or these other factors that are at play. And I think it's particularly harmful because when you see like, I grew up poor working class. And even when I was writing Born Bride, or I would go to, talk about it, people would say, well, they would say, and they would email me, I got some hate mail, which I loved. I don't get as much anymore, but that was like, I was like, oh, you've arrived, you're getting like hate mail. Not hate mail, but like, just like contesting like my ideas. So, but one person said, well, it's easy for you to say, you prove your own self wrong. It's not systems. Look at you made it, and so I'm like, but I'm just one person, I'm just, so, there's always the extraordinary examples of people who've been able, like myself, to navigate broken systems and figure out how to get, to the other side, not by myself, but other people helping me as well. And then the expectation is that everybody should be able to do that. And that's just not the case. And so we're not clearing the path for people. So I think that's the biggest misperception. But it's the same when I think about, issues like mass incarceration or homelessness or hunger. It is that same sort of thinking that allows us to turn away from thinking about these issues in a bigger context, right? So mass incarceration is about a person who did something wrong, who committed a crime, until you find out that most people who are incarcerated are there for nonviolent offenses or quality of life crimes like shoplifting or something like that, but have, get 20 years, and so it just seems it's not balanced. It's not, but those explanations are the ones that allow us to turn away from really thinking about how we're all impacted by these issues and how unjust they are.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience that I cannot see currently? Oh, Grace, we see you, but we can't hear you. It's okay. Nope, still can't. But I'll ask one in the meantime, or you can type it. So you mentioned how there's kind of a lack of connectivity between different systems, and which sometimes gives people the excuse not to really understand how one issue in one area might also impact another issue in so many other areas. As graduate students, where we are often trying to figure out what in the world we want to do after we graduate, what would you say to encourage us to remember that system connectivity, and rather than just delving into one area, and how that might lead us to over time forget the importance of the connectivity, especially in terms of intersectionality?
So I have two answers. The first is that come work for IWPR, we're hiring. So when you get done, check us out. That's number one. And number two is that I do think that it's important that you can become an issue area expert, right? So you can become an issue area expert on climate change. You can become an issue area expert on housing, poverty, hunger. It's the issue is about how do you approach that issue. You can approach that issue intersectionally, thinking about the connectivity between, homelessness and mental health, homelessness and addiction, homelessness and trauma and abuse, homelessness and racism, like you can take any issue and have a deep expertise around that issue, and also have a very nuanced, layered understanding of what that issue really is and what's impacting it and what's driving the way it plays out in people's lives. So that's what I would say, to that. I'm one, I started my career doing work on violence against women. That's, when I was in college, I started community organizing around violence against women. But we all know that economic vulnerability is a really big issue for women who are victims of violence. And so I saw that those links very early on. But most of my work today is around women's economic security, but understanding that women's economic security, violence against women, health, all the other issues are impacted by women's ability to be economically secure because they make different choices, or reproductive health. And so being able to just connect those dots, I think is really, important, but I'm all for deep expertise. And that's how you get the good jobs, by the way, having deep expertise, just FYI.
That's really helpful.
Hold on, my Loom cube fell off. I love to feel like I'm illuminated.
It's working. Thank you so much for that. So I guess let's try to see if Grace is able to.
Hi, yes, sorry about that. Yeah, basically my question is kind of in a way similar to what you were just asking, Awole, but from the perspective of how we kind of train policymakers or future leaders to think about these things from a kind of curriculum sense, in terms of
policy schools and how we learn about these problems. Because I guess I really liked your idea of, in terms of when we think about constraints, thinking about, you know, not framing our ideas and the way we think about things just in terms of all the problems that currently exist, but trying to kind of conceptualize beyond that and framework things in a much broader and more, I guess, almost like radical sense. And it seems lots of students often have that kind of approach, but then it seems to sort of, I guess, fade as people move throughout their career and kind of get further up. So I was wondering, especially from your kind of own experiences in academia, how you think we can train policymakers better to continue to be aware of these things and continue to kind of challenge them the further up they go.
So I think the first thing is to create the space for it, especially in these policy programs. I mean, I was at NYU and I taught there, and I teach now at Georgetown, but these kinds of classes on intersectionality and some of these topics are few and far between. So if they're few and far between, what that means, what that signals to students is that these issues are not important, and that this is an alternative way of thinking about policy as opposed to the way of thinking about policy. And so if that is the case, then we're just going to be producing the same sort of analysts and policymakers over and over again. And, you know, in my opinion, it's well past time. Like it's not like we don't know that there's another way to think about this, or we need to be more inclusive and representative. But the truth of the matter is, by the way, is that many of the people who hold power positions, tenure professors, don't want to do it differently. You know, there is a canon. And I know as a graduate student, by the way, I mean, I keep saying by the way, because I love saying by the way, but you get told like there's a way to think about these issues. There is a right and wrong way to think about policy making, analysis, and whatever. And that can cost you your career in some instances, or like a mentorship or a partnership. And so it is high risk for graduate students, I think, especially those starting out in their careers, to take these risks. So again, thinking about institutions and systems, it's really up to the schools to expand their framework and thinking about these issues and the way they are integrated into the curriculum. Like, it doesn't make sense, you know, even we're the faculty of color who can speak to these issues on you know, in schools. I mean, come on. All the schools, you know, there's not one program that I can think of where there's a number of faculty of color, not one. But a number of faculty of color, and the expectations of non-faculty of color is that they don't even have to think about these issues in the same way. So I would say it starts really at the institutional level, and the students will follow. If you tell them what the curriculum is, they want a degree. they want to get out. They're going to do whatever you say to do to get the degree and get out and learn what you tell them to learn. At least that's what I tell my students. You're going to get this right because you want an A. Anyway, but
that is, yes, that is accurate. Thank you so much. I see Venus.
Hi, sorry, my video is just not cooperating with me today. I apologize. But you mentioned the university setting and faculty of color. And so I was wondering if you had any thoughts specifically around retention, because in America, retention is such a big problem, especially with faculty of color gaining tenure and actually moving up in an academic setting, that they have to continuously move around just to gain access to, equal opportunity.
I mean, obviously, what you will learn, or what you will see if you haven't seen it already, is that like it's a very tenuous, precarious situation for faculty of color. And many of the I think it's hard. I have friends who I decided that's not the route I wanted to go, and I just couldn't do it. But I have friends who are tenured professors, and before they got tenured, the only thing I would hear them say is, when I get tenure, I will. Because there was some danger there and doing the kind of research or pushing the envelope or challenging, of the institution, the institutional practices that they could not do. But also there is also a burden and expectation that this work that we've been talking about today is their responsibility. And again, that's really unfortunate because it lets everyone else off the hook for these kinds of this work, this analysis, this framework, this thinking. So faculty of color are holding so much. And again, and still fearful that they won't get tenure or promotion or, have to hop around or even get a job in the first place. But I tell you something, I think that, and I'm not trying to tell you what to do, by the way, but the space of possibility for me, and it was always the case for me, and a few other of my colleagues, sometimes I wish I had tenure, by the way, but the space of possibility for me has always been outside of the academy. So, and you can do both. I do both now. But I think that you just have to think about where you want to be, especially as a person of color or a person who, wants to do these really interesting things with their research. You can research outside of the academy. But I do think that, the academy is pretty precarious for faculty of color for a lot of reasons.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we're coming up on time, and those are all great questions. It would be an honor if we could actually hear you read just a small excerpt from your book, just because we have a book club within the Women's Network, and we would really like to have your book as the book of one of our next months. So if you're willing and have a copy close to you, we'd love to hear you speak.
I don't even know. Okay, hold on, by the way. I do have one copy. Let me see it. Oh, I haven't read in a long time. So, let me see. Let me see. I want to read the part about this is, putting me on the spot here, but I want to read the part about systems in schools, from Cell Block High. And it's just one page. It's actually just, okay. I mean, I'm just going to read from Cell Block High because I think it's just sort of puts a nice bow on our conversation. Okay. So the chapter is Cell Block High, and in the chapter, just for context, I'm talking about the school system. And I think growing up, I guess I had no idea I was poor. I had no idea we were poor. But I also didn't have any idea that the schools that I attended were considered failing schools. I didn't know that. So I just assumed that I was getting the same level of education as all other kids. I was unaware of the educational disparities. And actually, and part of the reason was because I'd never been into a middle-class neighborhood until after I left to college. So I just really didn't know. And it wasn't until I got to college that I realized that I was poor, because I was in a classroom and they were talking about poor people and the programs that they accessed. And I was like, wait a minute, I accessed those programs. And it was just a mix of emotions. And so in writing the book, Born Bright, it was really, it was a hard experience. But what I got to do was, you know, think about my childhood self and put that self in conversation with myself today, who knows all the stuff about policy and these unequal systems. And I remember writing this chapter. So first of all, my editor was like, you can't, no, don't say that. Because I think in this chapter, I had gotten to a point where I was just like, these systems are bullshit. We went to shitty schools. I mean, I remember writing that as the first sentence, and you know, as you read, when you read it, it's not there. Okay, so it got taken out, and it's more, you know, a little nicer. So anyway, so this is Cell Block High, and I'm just going to read this one page. So it says, on television and in movies, urban schools are often portrayed as dangerous, inadequate, and teeming with teachers and staff who have checked out. In some portrayals, these schools are literal war zones. More times than not, the parents are rendered as absent, drug addicted, abusive, or neglectful. In the white mind, which I assume these depictions are meant to appeal to, these narratives are comforting and congruent with dominant perceptions and beliefs about poor and low-income communities. What is harder to imagine, though, is that these schools are much less characterized by danger and violence than they are by benign neglect, understood as a willful denial of access to equal resources, equipment, qualified teachers, and vital social networks. On the surface, these schools look and function like many others in America, including schools in middle-class neighborhoods. The bells all ring at the same time. However, they are far from equal. A large part of the difference is the expectations of what students in predominantly Black and Latino schools will become when they leave the school system. If, as a nation, we believe consciously or subconsciously that these students will drop out, go to prison, get pregnant, or end up in low-wage jobs, the system or institution will bend to those expectations and treat the students accordingly. The environment, including the teachers and helpers, will also reflect those expectations. Is that okay? Can I stop there or no? Or,
no, that's great.
Because then I go on and start to tell the stories, and you know. But you should read the book if you haven't read it. You know, and if you want me to come back after you read it to discuss it, I can do that.
Thank you so much. That's extremely exciting and good to know. I thank you. We have a question. How can I purchase the book in the UK? Pretty sure it's on Amazon. I'm pretty sure I saw it.
It's on Amazon, and it's also, you can listen to it, but let me just tell you, the voice is pretty annoying of the person who's reading it. So probably won't listen to that voice all day, but the book is available on Amazon, I think, and maybe through, you know, not Audible, but ebooks.
Yes. Thank you so incredibly much. This has been absolutely incredible. Learned so much in all things intersectionality. And I mean, I wish we were in a room where we could all applaud and everything, but honestly, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure to get to listen to you, and I would love to take your course somehow, some way. But yeah, we look forward to having you back, and thank you so much for your time, and best of luck with everything. We'll be sure to keep following everything that you're doing at IWPR.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me.